Greetings, let's dive in at Chapter 1, Mechanisms of Pain. A conceit driven into us from childhood is the idea of five senses. These days, even undergraduate textbooks speak rather of five primary senses, understanding that there are more than five, perhaps many more. Without thinking very hard, we can come up with the five obvious senses: vision, olfaction, odor detection, audition or hearing, gustation, taste, and touch. With a little more imagination, we can come up with the sense of balance or equilibrioception to keep up the theme. This sense has its own pathway from environment to the brain. The inner ear is full of fluid, and the chambers in this twisting canal called the cochlea can detect where that fluid is resting heaviest. Thus, you turn your head, the fluid rests in a new spot in the cochlea, and you know how your body is oriented in space. Balance. For balance, there's even a large area of the brain devoted to its processing. This is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum sorts out your balance and coordination and ships that information forward to the frontal lobes so you can know about it. By this measure, balance is a whole different sense than hearing, even while hearing uses parts of the same apparatus. Hairs in the cochlea vibrate to incoming waves through that same cochlear fluid. The rate at which various of the hairs, called cilia, vibrate gets converted into brain signals, and those signals get shipped to part of your brain for processing, the temporal lobes. And from there up to the frontal lobes, substantively the seat of consciousness. Again, without stretching much, we can come up with proprioception, or the kinesthetic sense. This is your body's sense of itself, of your embodiment. It is how you know where your hands and feet are when you're lying in bed, even when there's no mirror on the ceiling. You can sense the passage of time, thanks to an organ deep in your brain. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a fun word to play around with. You have itches, feel the pull and relaxation of your muscles, lots of other senses that you never really think about. In fact, it's no trouble at all to come up with 9 senses, and some scientists who study things list more than double that number. Touch is itself at least 3 senses. Human skin can detect touch and temperature as well as pain. Pain, also known as nociception, has its own receptors and pathways. Nociceptors in the skin are triggered by things that damage the body in some way. Excessive temperature or pressure, for example. They're not triggered by ordinary temperatures or pressures or non-harmful chemicals in the eyes. It is possible to trick these receptors with illusions, just as the other senses can be fooled. For example, go over to your sink right now. Take some care if you're reading this in a non-waterproof format. Fill a glass or jug with cold water, then run the faucet so that the water is lukewarm. Now, put your hand under the faucet and pour the water from your glass over it at the same time. Your nociceptors will become confused, experiencing painful heat when there's none present. So we can make a good case that pain is a distinct sense, separate from all the other senses. And this must be our first major question. Why? Evolutionary psychology. Some psychologists embrace a discipline called evolutionary psychology. This discipline, broadly speaking, attempts to explain why modern humans think, feel, and act as they do, using the principles of natural selection. In other words, they assume whatever traits we have, whether physical or behavioral, evolved to help us survive in some environment we encountered long in our past. There are distinct weaknesses to this approach. The primary weakness is the high level of creativity required to have a chance at testing the assertions of evolutionary psychology. It's therefore largely, though not entirely, a speculative discipline, like the kinds of cosmology that suggest 11 dimensions or multiple universes. Since there is no way to detect such phenomena, these ideas are hard or even impossible to put to the test. Take, for example, assertions regarding the relative promiscuity of males versus females. It has always been well understood that males are more promiscuous than females, at least in human society. Rogers and Hammerstein typify the idea in The King and I. A girl must be like a blossom, with honey for just one man. A man must be like a honey bee, and gather all he can. To fly from blossom to blossom, a honey bee must be free, but blossom must not ever fly from bee to bee to bee. When we ask humans about their mating habits, it is quite difficult to get at honest answers. Prior to the last 20 years or so, the research showed that the king of Siam was quite right. Men were generally more promiscuous and women were more inclined to monogamy, etc., etc., etc. This finding extended to all our studies of human sexuality, including same-sex relationships. We surmised that gay men must be much more promiscuous than straight ones, having partners who were equally promiscuous and therefore tolerant of such promiscuity, and found data to match. For example, the 1978 book Homosexualities is cited by a great many sources agitating against homosexuality. These supposed differences have been explained in the past by noting the evolutionary advantages of each type of behavior. Females are the ones who experience a long, draining pregnancy and are limited in the number of children they can produce, and who are largely stuck with the child-rearing activities. Therefore, it makes sense for the female to be very selective about the father she chooses for her children, as well as to do everything she can to keep that father nearby as a provider. Males, on the other hand, were thought to take advantage of the fact that they can produce millions of sperm a day and spread them far and wide through the population. Given this capacity, as well as a general lack of attachment to children, through not experiencing pregnancy or a supposed maternal instinct, having no capacity to breastfeed, and so on, it would make sense for such an organism to combine its DNA with as many other examples of the species as possible. More variation means more chances of the male's own DNA surviving into the next generation. The major problem with such theories is that they try to explain a phenomenon that is not real, or not nearly as real as we thought it was. Our findings regarding female promiscuity have more to do with our paternal approach to sex than with anything inborn into female kind. We need not imagine growing up in a society dominated by men. Everyone alive right now really has. We've lived heretofore in a society in which traditional marriage is an agreement between men, the bride's father and the bride's suitor. Go have another read of Romeo and Juliet, for example. The main problem with the romance at hand is that the father does not agree to it. Marriage has always had at its core the union of two families with the approval of the father. Wedding rings, the throwing of a bridal bouquet, and the father of the bride both giving her away and paying for the wedding all have their origins in these patriarchal traditions. Less savory traditions that still go on include checking the bride's hymen to demonstrate she's a virgin, selling the bride at a very young age to guarantee the same thing, and female circumcision to eliminate temptation. When we actually study the behavior of gay men, rather than just asking questions or allowing our biases to reign, we find that there is no more promiscuity in same-sex relationships between men than in any other relationships involving men on average. When we study actual female sexual behavior, we find women are, on average, just as promiscuous as men when women feel like they can get away with it. And here's the rub. Female sexual behavior is now, and has always been, controlled by men. Think, for example, of modern efforts to eliminate abortions and birth control, to limit women to the behaviors we think they actually have and that are actually appropriate to the patriarchal, conservative, fundamentalist society in which many of us live. Think of the ways in which we refer to promiscuous women as sluts and promiscuous men as studs, lady killers, etc., etc., etc. In other words, women have lied when men have asked them about their sexual habits because the punishments for violating the sexual norms of our time have generally been quite swift and severe. and the behavior of gay men might represent wish fulfillment on the part of non objective observers from the outside, with access only to the most active, obvious gay men who actually represent a very small subset of the population. Evolutionary psychology came up with a quite convincing and robust explanation for a phenomenon that was purely illusion. The stereotypes endorsed by such thinking are harmful to women as well as men, and not just those men who do not conform to heterosexual norms. In other words, they cause pain. Where does that leave either the explanation or the field itself? More or less every branch of science experiences such setbacks, and we have a choice: abandon the field entirely, pretend the mistake never happened, or learn from it and move on humbly. So, humbly, this. Pain can be said to survive in human populations because it has survival value. And that value is to teach us to avoid situations and conditions that create aversive stimuli. That is, pain teaches. Organisms that do not experience pain and discomfort would tend to be removed from the human population as they would lack a certain capacity to learn from their mistakes. Imagine, for example, two groups of monkeys. One group of monkeys are discomfited by vomiting, the natural consequence of eating foods that are toxic. And the second group, while they experience the same reaction, feel no aversion to it. Each group discovers some new fruit in their environment, the tomato-like nightshade. Each group gives the fruit a try. The first group will quickly learn never to eat that fruit again. The tomato is in fact part of the nightshade family and was shunned as poisonous for centuries. The second group will eat it and get sick, then eat it and get sick again, and so on. The first has a clear survival advantage. Evolution is rarely so obvious and clear-cut. There are bottleneck situations or founder effects in which only a few individuals survive a rapid change in conditions and therefore pass on specific mutations, like the low genetic diversity of Pitcairn Island, founded by a handful of mutineers of the Bounty. For the most part, evolution is a game of margins. Specific mutations move slowly into and out of populations as they result in a small percentage chance difference in breeding. Behavior is the same. Many behaviors can result in passing on genes. Over time, one might come to be more represented or less, but we can only speak of tendencies rather than absolutes. Pain is one of those things it would be quite difficult to live without. Everyday life becomes something of a challenge when the organism cannot learn quickly to avoid sharp rocks or hot surfaces or fist fights, joint torsion or tension, and so forth. Perhaps consequently, such variation is rare in our species. There are a few living examples of humans whose pain sense is in some way disabled, and they've generally had to make quite serious adaptations to the environment to compensate. The genetic level, though, is not the only way to acquire a pain disability. Diabetic neuropathy and leprosy, eponymously called Hansen's disease, both damage nerves beginning in the extremities, making it hard for the affected person to know when they've suffered injuries to those extremities. This is what underlies the necrotizing of tissue. Insensitivity leads to untreated injuries, infection, and ultimately loss of tissue. For example, in some Asian cultures, neuropathy is treated with hot foot baths. Ironically, the inability to feel pain leads to feet becoming burned in the baths meant to treat the neuropathy. It's also possible to lose the signal in the noise. Equally as harmful as insensitivity is oversensitivity, with people crippled by pain that does not reflect any environmental conditions. Conditions such as fibromyalgia can result in pain throughout the body without a well-known biological basis. The pain experienced by sufferers of such conditions is generally real, like the hypochondriac, they may eventually be dismissed by impatient doctors, or, perhaps worse, sometimes overtreated for unrelated conditions, or simply medicated to living death with narcotic medications by well-meaning physicians. It may even be inappropriately dismissed as a psychiatric disorder. I remember being at my own doctor a number of years ago to have some moles looked at. Thanks to fair skin and sun exposure, I have so many that some of them are bound to fit the criteria for suspicion. The doctor wanted to biopsy a few just to be sure, a most unsatisfying procedure inasmuch as the results for each were couched in medical terms, careful to avoid any liability. In other words, each of the four biopsies was inconclusive. But at some point in these proceedings, with a needle and a thread plunging in and out of my skin to sew up the chunk that was missing, I used some humor to try to defray the tension. "I'm your worst nightmare," I told the doctor. "A hypochondriac who has something wrong with him." His answer was not very reassuring. He replied, "Even a hypochondriac has to die of something." Pain has a function, and its most obvious function is to teach us about the environment. We can live without it or with too much of it. The inability to feel pain, imagining pain that isn't there, or experiencing pain with no medical explanation are all survivable conditions. But for the most part, we all feel pain, feel it for a reason, and learn from our experiences of pain. This is where our most elementary investigations into pain leave off. It has this purpose, and looking any more closely would be atypical. Pain is a consequence of evolution, and we should try to avoid it. If we have pain, we ought to treat it, make it go away, ideally while also curing the underlying cause of the pain. This is not, of course, all there is to it. But let us leave the investigation there for this time as we move on to comfort, analgesics, and palliatives. Comfort. Comfort has not historically been available to humans. It's a new concept, appearing and becoming widespread really only with the affluence afforded by post-war industrialism. For the vast majority of human history, comfort has not been much of a consideration. Consider that the United States as we know them are not possible without comfort. Many of our largest cities are in places where living is somewhere between impossible and extremely uncomfortable in summer months due to high temperatures. Take, for example, Phoenix, Arizona, San Jose, California, and essentially anywhere in Texas. Cities like Houston and Dallas are hard to conceive of without air conditioning, but are growing strong since that convenience became cost effective. This one comfort, widely available only since the 1960s, has made possible urban development in places otherwise quite difficult to inhabit. I was able to visit Singapore a few years ago. Even though it was not the hottest season, the heat was intense. The night zoo was well worth visiting. Where else can you walk through a pavilion full of friendly fruit bats? But even at night, the temperatures were well in excess of comfort. A local person we were staying with explained that most of life in Singapore is conducted indoors. You drive your air-conditioned car to an air-conditioned parking lot and then enter air-conditioned facilities to do your business. And this is the pattern of life in the summer months. There was so much beauty to observe outside, though, that I just had to get used to all of my clothing being soaked with sweat at all times. One of the major challenges of medicine has always been suffering. Suffering is distinct from pain. Suffering implies intolerable pain, experienced in such a way as to cause torment and trauma. Many of our advances in preventing such trauma originate with the US Civil War. It is during this time, with amputations very common, that physicians first had the will and the scientific knowledge to begin to formulate effective and available forms of anesthetics. Many other advances are endemic to this period, including better tools for surgery, the practice of embalming, and good sanitary practices. Professional medicine as we know it really begins here, on the battlefields of the bloodiest of history's wars, and is refined very much on other battlefields throughout history. Relief from pain had at this time largely consisted of quackery. Pseudo-medical devices purported to relieve wide ranges of symptoms, but with neither evidence nor even really theory to back them up. People experimented with electricity and magnetism, light, heat, and cold, and an absurd range of compounds. Oil, a substance without any material value until the creation of the gasoline engine, was one such compound sold by traveling hucksters as a cure-all. Once, when I was 12, I surmised that a glass of the greenish juice from a pickle jar might cure my hiccups. Since there was only one pickle left, I ate it, then drank down the juice as only a 12-year-old really can. Indeed, my hiccups were gone following that beverage, and I proudly proclaimed to my mother, "Pickle juice cures hiccups." "Pickle juice will cure anything," she said. I took her to mean that as I took her to mean that as if she had said, "You can cure anything with a hammer or a bullet." This is especially relevant in an age of pharmaceutical advertising, when you can hear the side effects of the medicines they are selling and you wonder, is the cure worth the poison? But in this way, drinking oil might indeed have cured various ailments by rendering the drinker too sick or dead to care about their baldness or gout or fever anymore. Aspirin was first formulated in 1897 and widely available by 1899. This began a real revolution in approaches to pain. Willow bark was a well-known analgesic since long before this time, but its availability was low and its preparation was not widely known or used. Thus, commercialized aspirin in pill form was not the first pain relief available to humans, not by a wide margin, but was the first time people could effectively expect pain relief. As medicine continued to advance, a number of other things became more reasonable to expect. For example, infant mortality began to decline, and then that decline became precipitous. It became reasonable to name children shortly after their births, as one could expect most of them to live past the age of 2. Measurements of global life expectancy are very much impacted by declines in infant mortality. It became reasonable to expect to survive minor illnesses. As vaccination became common, we reasonably expected not to get certain classes of minor illnesses to begin with. Mumps and measles have all been eradicated in the US, notwithstanding a few outbreaks here and there related to anti-vaccination movements, with their origins in a fraudulent study by a British fellow named Andrew Wakefield. Other technology moved along just as swiftly. Manufactured goods became cheap and common. Transportation became easy, fast, relatively safe. Law and order were imposed on a formerly chaotic landscape. People began to be able to buy things like upholstered furniture, mattresses, carpets, air conditioners, all the things that make life comfortable. Even a modest modern apartment might appear the very lap of luxury to an American raised in the middle 1800s. Now, comfort is more an expectation for a modern US American than it is a luxury. We expect a comfortable ride, warm clothes, hot water on demand, sugar in everything, fast food and instant service, knowledge of world affairs, and updates on our friends and family far away, freedom from ambiguity and needless worry. This is all facilitated by the modern age of science and technology, even as that modern age introduces new discomforts such as wealth inequality. While all but the very poorest of us, and much of the population of the world outside the US and other post-industrial nations, live in relative comfort, we also wish, perhaps not unreasonably, to share in the great wealth concentrated in the hands of just a few individuals. In 2014, for example, just the 85 richest people worldwide controlled as much wealth as the poorest 365 billion, that's billion with a B, half the population of the earth at that time. But back to comfort, pain relief, and freedom from pain.